Hey everybody, this is going to be a very special episode this week. I was asked by Wanderbot to write some music for an animation that he's working on for a D&D campaign that he's running, and I obliged. So I tried to write something that I thought would be very fantasy-esque, very like I took a lot of inspiration from Jeremy Sewell and stuff like that when I wrote this piece, and I'm going to use this video to talk about how I wrote it from a technical perspective as well as the music theory perspective. And then afterwards, for people that are here live, I'm going to take some questions if they have any. And I'm also going to take some questions from the comments as well when this video does go up, I believe, on Monday. Now, I've never done a music analysis video like this before, so this is going to be some brand new stuff for me. But generally, what you do is you start off by playing the thing, and then you talk about the thing. So we'll get through step one there, and we'll start by playing the thing. So here we go. Okay, so that's the whole thing. So yeah, like I said, I was trying to go for something that felt... My entire composition process, at least the very beginning of it, was I thought to myself, what's the most Dungeons and Dragons thing I can write? And then I decided I'll do that. So there you go. From a technical perspective, how I put this piece together. So I have over here a whole bunch of... let's put it on... which one is it? I guess we'll put it on all. So I basically have a bunch of MIDI controllers that all go out to a legato. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but I have an external program that runs that takes the MIDI data from FL Studio and then turns it into kind of performance data. So what it will do is it will take the violin samples, for example, and it will add a more human type of playing to it and then send that data back into FL Studio. So why I did that, and I don't have those performance tools running right now because they're very system heavy, but the difference that having that human touch is that if I just control the violins using the built-in tools, I get control over pitch and I get control over volume, and that's it. So it would be like if somebody was playing the violin and they were just like, you don't get any of the subtleties to it. But like if you put in the human touch, you get the different qualities of the sound, because it will choose it'll emulate the bow strength, how much the violin player is pushing into the instrument with the bow, as well as the legato touch. So it'll be like more like stuff like that. I can't really do a good violin impression, but there you are. So that's a way to go using these synthetic strings to go from a very MIDI low quality type of feeling into something that has a little bit more nuance to the sound. So I did that for every single instrument in the orchestra, and I could have done a lot more instruments, but I chose to limit it to just a string quartet here. Well, it's not a string quartet, it's a string on like a full chamber ensemble. So this is 14 violin samples, this is like 14 violas, this is 2 cellos, and this is 2 basses. And then this is a solo oboe, and then at the very end we have a solo French horn. So I only wrote out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I guess we also have a guitar that's being sent out. So 6. I only wrote out 7 instrument parts. So this was a smaller project. I had never really worked with the orchestral stuff before, so I wanted to keep the scope down a little bit to make sure that I got it done within a reasonable amount of time. This song took me about 3 days to do in total. So I split it up over approximately like a week and a half of work, but about 3 or 4 sessions of about 2 hours apiece to get it to the state that it got in. After that, I recorded out all of these tracks individually into recording segments, pre-recorded segments, so that I could know that it would play back it the exact same way every single time. I would be able to have it be very consistent. So when it came to the final render, one, I wasn't using as much CPU power, because to put the human touches on all 7 of the instruments uses a fair bit of CPU. If it's just playing a .wav file, if it's a pre-recorded sample, then you don't have to use real CPU time to make those recordings happen. So what we're gonna do now, that more or less sums up the technical side of things. I guess the other thing that I did, well, okay, we'll hold off on talking about that so much, but that's literally just the end all of all the real low key technical things. Hardware limitations considered when making music, that's crazy. Hardware limitations are actually a huge part of making music. You will very, very quickly and very rapidly butt up against the limitations of your computer when you have multiple synthesizers going on at any given time. These are fairly low CPU usage, but they still added up after a little while. If I were to pull a whole bunch of the other synthesizers that I have, those can be extremely CPU heavy. So it's a pretty common trick, especially if you have stuff that's a little bit on the more unreliable side, to pre-record your things before you do your actual final render. So let's go ahead and mute the tempo thing. I'm now going to talk about each individual piece within the realm of stuff that's interesting to talk about from a music theory perspective, so you can understand how I compose this thing. I guess something that's not going to be here is the way I initially came about writing the melodic content for this piece. That was me in the shower. I started humming something. I left the shower. I walked over to my piano, and then I played it. It's just like the melody was just in my head, and I knew exactly how I wanted to do it, and that was the long and short of it. When you're making stuff that's very kind of straightforward, it doesn't take a whole lot of work to come up with the melodic content so much. And this piece was actually remarkably straightforward to put together. So let's pull apart the violin part in the very beginning. Broadly, this piece is broken down into 3 sections. The first stuff is all just the strings. So we're gonna play through the string stuff, and then I'll focus in on the melody, and we can talk about that a little bit more. So let's play through this. Actually, let's I could, even if I felt like it, we could go into the melody itself, and we can have this up so we can see the names of the notes while it plays through, instead of just like looking at this very small screen over here. Okay, so that's the first phrase, and it's a very, very like typical kind of phrase. We basically have the major chord progressions and the major notes all happening on the same beat. And it's worth noting that I have this repetition right here. This was something that I initially tried to write away from, but I ended up going ahead and just keeping this repetition in. So if you notice, we have the exact same notes repeating in the exact same rhythms here. That's considered a little bit, I want to say, on the amateurish side to be that boldface repetitive, but it's also not something I'm really taking too seriously to try and work around. But I figured, because this was something that was not going to be something I take too seriously, like it was just going to go up in the background of a YouTube video, I was going to cut that corner and not really feel too bad about it. We pull apart violin phrase 2 here. We have the same pickup note, and literally, if you look at what happened here, phrase 1, what? Oh, that's viola phrase 1, my bad. I named violin phrase 1 pattern 1 because that was the default. The only things that changed between violin phrase 1 and violin phrase 2 are these last 2 notes. That was super duper intentional. I wanted this to feel very, very, very on its face and like its simplicity here. So if we listen to the second phrase, it feels very much like the first phrase, except for the very, very end, which is a perfectly fine way of doing things. But if we listen to it in context, everything else is different enough that it feels like there's a lot more that's different between the first phrase and the second phrase. So we'll listen to it all in context now. Whoa, that was weird. Oh, I had the tempo turned off, so my samples were playing a little bit strangely. That was... Anyway. So the melody is basically the exact same. The violin part doesn't change, but it all sounds very different because all of these other parts are super duper different, and that was a very intentional way that I wrote all that out. And let me explain how that all works, because this is where we start to get into stuff that's actually really neat. And we'll pull the violin part in here, and we'll turn off the tempo, and we'll mute the violin tracks. So I'm looking at the viola track now, and let's pull out the piano roll for the viola track as well. So viola phrase 1, and we want to be on this piano roll. Okay, so first things first, I used a method of composition called counterpoint. Counterpoint is incredibly technical. I studied counterpoint for multiple years to even be half good at writing counterpoint. And the way counterpoint works is it's a very old school way of writing music. But the way that it works is you take 2 melodies and you play them at the same time. And you write the melodies such that when you play them both at the same time, they sound good together. There's a lot of rules that you have to obey to make that sort of stuff work. One such thing I did is we have the first 3 notes of the viola track are B, A, and G. And then if we look at the violin melody, we have the violin E, F sharp, and G. So I have right away Where did it go? We wanted to get to the violin or the viola phrase on phrase 1. So I have this contrary motion that's going on here between the violin part and the viola part. So if we just play those two segments out, you can hear, just listen for the first 3 notes. You hear that they move in harmony with each other, but they're also independent of each other. So actually, let's play out the violin part by itself, and you can probably hear what I'm going for a little bit more. So that's that in and of itself sounds like a reasonable melody, but it's playing second fiddle, so to make a really horrible pun there, to the main melody. But when you play them together, you get this really, really awesome effect of just these two independent voices that are working together, but also individually. The other thing that I did to strengthen that sort of idea was I have this rhythmic motive here, where we do. Let's put the violin track on. I have that. That's called a lower neighbor tone. So I have that going on in the violin track as well. This is the viola track, sorry. So that was a intentional echoing of what's going on in the other melody that actually happens before what in where it takes place in the main melody. So it's foreshadowing in the viola track things that happen in the violin section. That's just stuff that you can do, that you learn how to do to make your compositions just generally more nuanced and more interesting to listen to. That's pretty much all there is to say about the viola track, except for in the first phrase anyway. If we listen in the second phrase, we get some very interesting stuff happening there as well. So things to listen for here are, for the second phrase, I made the parts even more independent than I did in the first phrase, so as to continue to layer interesting stuff to listen to, basically. One thing that I did in the viola phrase 2 here, that's the violin phrase, the viola phrase 2, where are you hiding? Here we are. So we have C, D, and E in the viola, and in the violin we have E, F sharp, and G. So here we have in the very first phrase where I had the two parts moving contrary to each other, where they're starting apart and then they're moving inward. You hear those voices are moving apart from each other. This time, as a way to distinguish the two phrases, I had them move parallel to each other. So you can hear, that was just one thing I did to distinguish the musical ideas that are going on in this piece. To that end, I also did other things where I had the violin and the viola, I had them offset their note values. So here we have the violin moving a little bit faster. Sorry, I keep saying that. The viola is moving faster than the violin, so you can hear that it's distinct voices that are going on there. So you can, that's a good way to keep your piece distinct, because if I had done this, I can't show you because everything is pre-recorded, But if I had done this, for example, then what would have happened is the voices start to lose their independence from each other, and then when that occurs, you don't get stuff that sounds like strings anymore, especially if you're using synthetic strings. You start to get stuff that sounds like a horn section, because the strings, especially if they're synthetic, rely on a lot of subtle changes and a lot of independence from each other. Whereas in an orchestra, when you hear horns, they are very much in this unified, like you just kind of hear them all moving together. So if you don't have those these moments that distinguish the parts from each other, you will end up not making your stuff sound like an orchestra anymore, basically. And one last part that I think is particularly of note, you can hear that I did the same thing on this note, where I made this note have a longer value. So I staggered the rhythms a little bit there as well, so that you have the violas holding on before moving, and the violins are moving ahead. So we have the violas speeding up and then slowing down, whereas the violins stay mostly stable throughout that whole rhythm. The last thing that's of note is I did something that's a very, very, very old way of writing music, where I had the violas come to their final notes before the violins did. So in the viola, we land on this E at the very, on this beat right here. You see this is before the 4. And you can see here that the violins move one beat later than the violas do. That's an extremely old way of writing music. That was considered the way to do things in like the 1300s. We kind of moved away from writing that sort of stuff, but because I wanted to evoke this very old, antiquated sound, I decided to bring that back a little bit. The cello part exemplifies that as well. If I pull that in, and I won't talk so much about the cello part, because it's mostly just there for flavor. It's not really doing a whole lot of stuff that's too particularly different from anything else is doing. Cello phrase 2, we'll drag that in, and we'll plonk that in right there. So in the cello part, you can see that you can see that I did a lot of the staggering things I was talking about earlier, where I tried to make it so that the cello stayed static and then stepped, stayed static and then stepped, and then it did 2 steps there. So a lot of work was putting into making this original cello line stand out from the violins and the violas. So if you get the... we'll just play this second half of this first phrase. Yeah, so I like lime flavored cello. So I put in this little like note at the very end here to have the cello have a little bit of a solo moment, because otherwise, without that, you would just have 3 to 4 beats of just like nothing happening, and this way we can keep the musical ideas moving forward, but the melody itself can come to a small hesitation there. And then in the cello phrase here, I did a lot of the same stuff where I had the I was staggering a lot of the notes, so we'll just play through the second phrase. So, again, as I was saying, with the idea of each note ending its melody on a different time, the cellos, they end their note here, they end their melody here, the violas end their melody here, and the violins end their melody here. So you get this really cool effect of where things slowly start to come to an end, as opposed to everything just coming to a hard stop together at the same time. See, that's a very delayed feeling, and like I said, it's a very, very old technique that has not really been in too much favor. I mean, people still do it probably fairly often, but it's really associated with a very old way of writing music. Yeah, there's not too much to say about the cello part, and the bass part is even less interesting because the bass part is just notes where I could have done a lot more interesting stuff, but I chose not to because I didn't want to work that hard. That is the honest to God truth. I cut major corners here. So if I would play it, but it would be very, very uninteresting. I muted the wrong things. Yeah, I did nothing of any sort of noteworthiness there. So I'm not going to talk about it too much. I literally just supplied the harmonic foundation of the rest of the piece, and then that was it. One thing that makes this whole piece work, though, is really super simple. I was talking about how in the violin phrase 2, even though the melody was the exact same, I changed the harmonic structure so that it starts on a different note in the bass than it does in the first phrase. So in the first phrase, we start down here. And in the second phrase, we start up here with the bass. So what you get is when you listen here, that, and then more or less the same melody. It's very distinct feeling because of the change in the bass note there. What else is there to say? These other things are just volume automations that I put in so that I made the stuff over time get louder and softer. I also, each individual note has different volumes associated with it, so this way I was able to get the whole phrase to have a certain volume direction as well as each individual note. If you don't do that, then it gets really, really synthetic feeling really fast, because a human player, they're gonna naturally vary their bowing strength and their bowing speed and how much they're pouring into something into a given note pretty much constantly. So the way to get your strings to not sound like shit if they're synthetic is you have to vary each individual note strength. If I look in the violin main melody here, we can see that these are my volume controls. Each note has a certain volume associated with it, so it gets a little bit louder, and then it gets a little bit quieter. And then I also change the overall volume a little bit as well, because with this, you see it's a step function. To use mathematical terms, I'm controlling the volume at the onset of the note, and then using this controller, I can shape it in the middle of the note to get louder and softer as well. Last thing I did was I threw on a tempo envelope, which allowed me to gradually speed up the playback of the piece, then slow it down, then speed it up again, then slow it down, and then put it at a fairly static tempo for the middle section. And that's more or less all she wrote for the start here. One last playthrough to put in everyone's minds, and then we'll move on to the middle section, which won't take nearly as much time, and then the last section, which will take even less time than that. So here we go with the first phrase. So I assume everyone was hopefully able to understand a little bit more of the well, I guess I shouldn't assume. I hope that after hearing the breakdown of a lot of that stuff, you're able to hear some of the subtle things that I was talking about where I had stuff ending at different times, and I had things echoing each other and repeating each other between the different string parts. The middle section, not a whole lot to talk about that's musically all that interesting. I just basically took the first section, changed some of the melody and the rhythms, and I put it into an oboe. And I made it a solo voice so that it would counterbalance the other section. I also added light percussive touches because in my head I just heard, oh yeah, a tambourine would sound really good there. And I just followed my instincts and I made it happen. I also put a guitar behind it because I wanted to be really cheesy. Absolutely nothing is really worth talking about in that section, to be totally honest. I mean, it just is very, very much a musically on its face little part. The only thing that I could possibly think about that would be interesting to discuss is the way to write a convincing guitar part with the synthesizer. If we go to the guitar phrase, I pull up the piano roll. It's a guitar. When you pluck a guitar, you hit the strings one at a time. Even if you're playing a chord, you have that offset where one string hits and then their hand keeps moving and hits the next string and hits the next string. So to get a very convincing performance, all you really need to do is that. You just make it so that the notes are offset from each other, and then you're good to go. The other thing I did that was kind of interesting is that I put it so that this is more in-depth theory. This is a technique that I've stolen from composers that are much better at this than I am. If you put the third of the chord on the bottom of the chord of your track, and then put the fifth above it, you get a very, very open and medieval sounding feeling out of it. And I would play where I got that idea from, but I don't want to get copyright problems in the video, so I'm not going to do that. But if you want, if people want to know like what a lot of the inspirations were and where I stole a lot of these ideas from, definitely feel free to ask towards the end of this video here. So yeah, we have these open chords, super duper simple guitar part, and I played it very quietly and I made it feel like strumming and very folksy in that moment, where you just have this far and away feeling flute. You have like a guitar lute-like instrument, and then you have a tambourine, which is about as folksy as it gets. Now, for the last section, let's see. Again, this is going to be like really, really fast to talk about in comparison to the first things, because so the violin phrase, the melody is literally this melody. It's violin phrase 2. I literally didn't change a single note. I just made it louder. Yeah, it's literally the exact same melody. I made it louder and I made it play through faster. So I increased the tempo and I increased the volume. And then the viola phrase, if we look at the things that I did, so a lot of the other parts, I have a lot of this nuance to talk about, where I talked about how the parts were super duper independent feeling from each other. I decided not to do that for the last phrase for very, very specific reasons. One, it took a lot less time to do. And two, because I started introducing a couple of other elements, like I put in the French horns for the first time, that changes what you're capable of doing. And by that I mean when you're it, if you think about all of the frequencies that the human mind can hear, basically, you have a fairly limited sonic space to work in, where each instrument is going to basically lay claim to X amount of bandwidth. Like, let me pull up like MS Paint or something to illustrate this point a little bit here. Oh, if I pull up Paint, if I say, let's increase this by like 1,000. Okay. If we want to graph the human the stuff that you can hear, down here is about, we'll say 30. Let's use my stylus so my handwriting isn't horrible. Now we're going to use it with the mouse. So up here, so here's 30 and here's 20,000. So you have basically like every instrument is going to lay claim to a certain amount of what your y-axis holds. So here's your violin part, and this is like a sine wave or whatever. Here's your viola part, here's your cello, and here's your bass. So each instrument is going to basically have like a little slice of this y-axis that it can conceivably hold. So this will be violin. Wow, here's the viola, here's the cello, and here's the bass. I started doing things like I added in the French horn, and the French horn lives like right here. So your viola and your French horn are occupying a very similar sound space. You can never get more than what you have here, basically. So what you need to do as you introduce more instruments is each instrument needs to become a lot simpler with what it's doing. So that way, if you that's the way that you retain your coherency in the piece. Otherwise, you get a whole bunch of jumbled up shit, and you cannot tell what's going on. And that's what I did here. So when we look at the viola, that got a lot simpler. You can just visually see that it got a lot simpler if you look at it. If you look at the cello phrase, that also got like super duper simplistic, where you just have these notes just holding and holding and not going anywhere. The bass was always simple, but it was like super duper simple. It's even more simple somehow. But the horns get to be a little bit more complicated. So if we play out that, I think that I have the important stuff. Yeah, so the horns got to be a lot more active. The violas, and I wasn't playing it, but the cellos and the bass all drop down in their interest, because as you introduce more instruments, as I said, you decrease the amount of bandwidth each instrument has. So you have to start making choices on what becomes more complicated and what becomes less complicated. You have like this foreground and background effect with the instruments that you choose. And I mean, you hear this in all kinds of music. You don't just hear this in orchestral music. This is a fundamental way that music works. If you listen to like some EDM track, for example, what you'll often hear is you'll hear like the effect called ducking, where what you do is you have like your bass drum and your snare drum overpowering for certain effects. You'll hear the bass drum and the snare drum become really loud, and then the other instruments become quiet. So you will have, Deadmau5 does this a lot, but you'll have like dum, 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 and you'll hear like they'll put this like string section over it that just becomes like what, like it gets like quiet and then it like gets loud and it gets quiet and it gets loud. So it's like and I would definitely play songs that amplify that, but I will absolutely get copyright strikes for doing that. So I'm not going to do that here. But if you listen to like what is it? Ghosts and Stuff by Dead Mouse, that has like this super cool feeling where the bass drum is just like basically every time it hits tells everything else in the song to shut the fuck up, and it's the only thing you can listen to in that moment. But yeah, so you do the same thing in this, you do the same thing in every style of music, because you have 20,000 hertz to work with, and that's all you get. You cannot put any more music in that radius. So that more or less sums up the way that I wrote this whole piece and produced it. I shellacked the whole thing in a ton of reverb because I wanted to cover up the fact that it was really synthetic instruments, and if you put a bunch of reverb on top of it, nobody can tell what the hell it actually is, so it ends up sounding a lot better as a result. So without any further ado, I guess if there are any questions live from the audience, go ahead and ask. And any questions that you leave on the video itself, I will go ahead and address when the time comes. So, Human 1997. Wow, I hope that's not the year we were born in, because if it was, I am old. Human 1997 asks, feels a bit like the Dragon Quest OST. Is that where you took your inspiration? I have never heard the Dragon Quest OST, but you are also the third person to point that fact out to me. So no, but I think that's really interesting that that happened. The primary sources of inspiration I had for this piece was basically the Oblivion soundtrack and the a lot of other things that I just like heard and like listened to for my entire life. Can I play it through one more time for us? I'll do, if there are any more questions, I'll take those. If there aren't, we'll do one last listen through, and then we'll just end the video on that note. But yeah, I wrote this with a lot of things in mind, but primarily I listened to the Oblivion soundtrack for my go-to inspiration. That being said, a lot of fantasy music is literally just a repackaging of classical music from, I want to say, the 1900s to the 1930s, early 1930s, like no later than 1930s. That's when a lot of composers were writing in the English tradition. They were writing a lot of stuff that sounded like very folksy type of music, and it sounded, they would take like British children's stories or hymns or things like that. They would take those pieces and then they would make them into orchestral suites, and nothing sounds less like Dungeons and Dragons than somebody taking a British like hymn or children's song and then putting it into the string section. So if you want to find out like where, if you listen to like all these composers that write these like fantasy soundtracks, and you're like, wow, where do they get their ideas to do this sort of thing? How can they also sound so cohesive? They all basically stole it from the same like three dudes. And those were, the first one I can think of is a guy by the name of Vaughan Williams that really did a lot of that stuff. He's a huge favorite composer of mine, and when you listen to him a little bit, you start to realize that basically every fantasy soundtrack ever is trying to recreate what he did back in like 1905. That's really the long and short of it. So I don't see any more questions. So I'm just going to go ahead and play this out. And if you have any more questions, absolutely leave them on the video or just message me on Discord or something like that. But let's do one last little listen through, and I will probably start. Yeah, that's probably the last thing I'll do here. Yep, not much to talk about after everything else that's been said. So, thank you for watching. Where is it? No, I can't cut the recording very smoothly.